media coverage since then, Ad Age and Digital Content Next, just to name a few. So we're really excited to share this content with you today. Just one logistical thing to start off is we should have a few minutes at the end for questions. So if you have any questions as Joline is walking through this presentation, just throw them in the box on the right, and we will probably be able to address them at the end. So now I'm going to turn this over to Joline McGoldrick. She was the thought leadership lead on this initiative. She's going to walk you through the findings and the implications. So Joline?
Great, thanks Katie. Hello everyone, thanks for joining today. So I will be discussing the Getting Audiences Right piece of thought leadership with you. And sort of the theme that I want to really drive home today in this is that there are things that you'll hear in this presentation that are real aha, things that maybe things that you didn't know and that will come as a surprise to you. And then other things you will know are things that you might have intuitively known. But what we really want to do is be able to put some numbers around the behavior we're seeing and the preferences that we're seeing, because we know that even though things can be intuitive, right, those business decisions that you have to make about where you invest and where you don't invest, where you spend more time, more thought, and more research, that those things really do have to be numbers driven. So as I'm going through this presentation today, I'll point out some of the things that to us are surprising and some of the things that are intuitive, but they're just numbers behind it. But we really want to start out this year with this theme of really getting back to basics. So there are so many questions about things like app development and what are the emerging media formats that are present. But it really ultimately starts with the audience, which is where we want to start today, right? Which is understanding the audience and their behavior and their preferences. So then when we're thinking about media and the other touch points that as brands we make with our audiences and our consumers, we can really be rooted in that core of audiences and their behavior. So what I'm going to cover today is really three things. First, I'm just going to cover a cross-screen overview, what we're going to be talking about broadly, and why it's important. Then I'm going to go into screen preferences by each generation. When I say generation, I really mean a cohort by age, and I'll define that a little bit more as we get into it. And we'll go through screen preferences by generation for daily digital activities, consuming entertainment, and then shopping activities and the digital path to purchase. And finally, we'll close this afternoon with some implications and best practices for marketers. Okay, so briefly, the methodology. So this study is based on a survey that we ran late last year, beginning in October of 2014. And the survey was 1,018 respondents between the ages of 18 and 69 in the U.S. who own or have access to a smartphone or a tablet, right? So this is not Gen Pop, this is Gen Pop that has access to a smartphone or tablet. And it was a digital survey that they had the option of either taking on a mobile device, smartphone or tablet, or on a desktop device. So I'm going to start by just backing up a little bit here, and I want to talk about, because this theme really is looking at how generations are different, and we're going to be talking about three generations today. We're going to be talking about the millennials, which just generally are most interesting right now to marketers and media, and millennials right now are defined as those people between the ages of 18 and 34. We're going to be talking about Gen X. That's the generation that no one really talks about. That's between the ages of 35 and 49. And then finally, we're going to be talking about baby boomers, which are the generation that's 50 plus. And we'll talk more about sort of what defines them in those specifics. But why are generations so important? So one thing that we're very interested in is really trying to understand when these shifts in receptivity and in behavior are happening, right? What is it that makes people migrate to smartphones? What is it that makes people migrate away from or towards certain platforms? And it's important that we put things behind, dimensions behind it other than just the basic age and gender, right? It's important that we look at what those things actually mean. And so we think that generation is so important, because even though generation is talking about age, what generation really means is a shared set of media consumption, a shared set of technology introduction, and a shared set of beliefs about themselves and about the world, right? So what generation really does is it allows us to overlay a psychographic component that becomes important in really making our audiences come to life. So if we say audiences 18 to 34, it doesn't really mean that much, but when we talk about millennials, there are a lot more things that are brought up both in terms of their beliefs and their life experiences. So that's the lens that I'd like you to think about this data with. And so what we'll see is when we're looking at the screen preferences, that it's their generation that it's important, but we also see how audiences are really, in some ways, ahead of marketers in really diagnosing the right screen for the right task. So we'll look at some of those motivators behind what those things are that are making them choose each screen. And then finally, we think that shifts in generational preference are so important because we know that in the media, a lot of the coverage is really on the next, right? And for a long time, that next was millennials and what they're interested in. And now that next is Gen Z, which is our under 18 audience, and what they're interested in. And it is always absolutely essential that we keep an eye to the next. But the reality is when we have to make these marketing decisions, we're being evaluated on our 6-month, 12-month, 18-month, and 24 performance. So it's important that even though we can have an eye to the next, that we stay really firmly grounded in the now. And that's what we really hope that this presentation drives home. So just again, going back to generational definitions, right? So the millennial generation is those who were born after 1980. So the last millennial just turned 18, and this is nice for us because even if we weren't thinking about generations, this is the one year that it lines up with our traditional marketing age breaks. But millennials are between the ages of 18 and 34. Psychographically, we also want to think about them as the most multicultural of the generations we're going to look at, with 40% of them identifying as multicultural. They make up right now the largest segment of the population. Generation X makes up the smallest segment of the population. You can think about them as really a birth dip. They were born between 1965 and 1980, and they're currently between the ages of 35 to 50. So psychographically, in addition to that birth dip, there's kind of two important things that you should keep in mind. One of which is that this audience is smack dab in the middle of life, so they tend to be a little bit more productivity oriented than either the millennial generation, who tends to be a little more curiosity oriented, or the boomer generation that tends to be a little bit more relaxation oriented. And then the second thing is, and this comes from some Pew Research. If you look at Pew Research on generational feelings about their generation, both the millennial generation and the boomer generation, when asked, is your generation more exceptional than other generations, slightly more than 60% of those generations said yes. My generation is more important, and they cited reasons why. They both cited technology usage, intellectual curiosity. When they asked that same question to Generation X, is your generation more exceptional than other generations? Not even 50% of Gen Xers said yes. So definitely some psychographic components to beliefs that they hold about themselves and then about their cohort more largely, in addition to the media and technology consumption and introduction we'll talk a little bit about. So let's talk about the digital portrait of a millennial. So broadly, we see that millennials are really characterized by being mostly mobile. They're characterized by and are very self-aware of their mobile adoption, and they've really moved on to alternative entertainment choices. They're a mobile-first generation, but also these concepts of curation become a lot more important. They would definitely reject the idea that they can be passively broadcast to, which presents challenges for marketers figuring out what the right balance of communication is for this generation, and really being forced to navigate on some new channels with this generation, since we don't always find them on the traditional channels where we might find Gen Xers or boomers. So in terms of their device access, about 54% of our millennial sample had accessed or owned a Android smartphone, 53% owned or had access to an iPhone, 20% had owned or had access to a Windows smartphone, 5% identified that as other, 33% had owned or had access to an iPad, and 20% owned or had access to another type of Android tablet. I think one of the things that makes this generation so interesting really is this moving away from traditional content consumption, traditional TV. So we see that our challenge really becomes how to reach them differently. So 78% of millennial men watch YouTube on a weekly basis, and 67% of millennial women watch YouTube on a regular basis. Now contrast that for a second with how many of them watch cable TV or network TV. So 51% of millennial men watch cable TV, 55% of millennial women watch cable TV, but when you go down to network TV, that number drops to only 19% of millennial men and 24% of millennial women. We also see really like an emergence of Netflix as a popular entertainment channel, also 43% of millennial men watching it, 60% of millennial women. And so I think the important takeaway, and we're going to get into these numbers a little bit more in depth, is starting to think about how the rules change, right? So we already know that our TV spots cannot simply be stuck on YouTube and expected to have the same value, right? But starting to think about, okay, so if they really are on places like YouTube and Netflix and even emerging on Hulu or Amazon Prime, what is the right way for me to reach them? How does my video content need to be different on YouTube than it would be otherwise? Can I do a TV commercial at all? Does it need to be cut down, or does it thematically need to be something different? And we'll talk about this a little bit more as we get into it. Finally, in terms of broadly characterizing their consumer journey, 31% of them shop weekly or more often using laptops and PCs. 23% of them do that using smartphones, and 15% of them shop weekly or more often using tablets. Okay, let's move on to the digital portrait of the Gen Xer. So the Gen Xer is in midlife in more ways than just their age. They're also really the digitally transitional generation. They're really characterized by this combination of devices and entertainment formats. They're very much the use-it-all generation, and what they do on each device very much depends on the task at hand, in which task will help them do that most efficiently, rather than a de facto preference for a particular device. So if we start by looking at them by their device access, what we see is that 55% of them have access to an Android smartphone, 38% to an iPhone, 9% to a Windows phone, 6% identifying as other, 28% to an iPad, and 31% owner have access to another type of Android tablet. So definitely not as iPhone heavy as one might expect. They lean slightly more towards Android smartphones. When we look at their weekly entertainment usage, here's where we really see some of their transitional nature, right? And that 68% of men have watched YouTube on a weekly basis. The number's much lower for women, about 47%. So big gender shifts in some of the gender divisions in some of the entertainment choices. Cable is the same, which is not surprising. 61% of men and women have watched cable on a weekly basis. And then again, that dip for network TV down to 31% of men and 30% of women. You see that for Gen X, even though with this transitional generation, that watching Netflix weekly is actually higher than watching network TV weekly. So 39% of men watch Netflix weekly and 37% of women. And then when we look at their consumer journey, we see that they're more likely shop online using laptops than the previous generation. So 28% of them shop online with a laptop weekly or more often, 24% with a tablet shop weekly more often, and then 18% have shopped weekly or more often with a smartphone. Finally, let's take a look at the digital portrait of boomers. So there's I think 2 points I want to point out here. Many of these things about them are not surprising. We know that they're traditional. But what is surprising is that there's really, so generally it's been tempting to want to write off the boomers, right, as just an older segment who we're not interested in. But they have tremendous purchasing power and tremendous assets. So it's important that we really keep them in mind. Otherwise, we're walking away from really a big segment of the consumer base. And one of the things that's really interesting about them is that even though we tend to sort of write them off, their digital footprint is actually fairly substantial. So we see, I want to actually skip on this one and go to the consumer journey first and then fill in the blanks with the other pieces first, because I think the consumer journey piece is most surprising. That 31% of them shop weekly or more often using laptops or PCs. That number goes much lower for smartphones. Only 13% shop weekly or more often with smartphones, and then 18% shop weekly or more often than tablets. So this idea that boomers are very traditional oriented, it's true in some senses when we talk about entertainment in a second, but also is not true in the sense that they really do have a large digital consumer footprint. In terms of their device access, we see that 50% of them own or have access to a Android smartphone, 24% of them own or have access to an iPhone, 8% to a Windows smartphone, 21% to an iPad, and 37% to some other form of an Android tablet. In terms of their weekly entertainment consumption, their biggest channel for weekly entertainment consumption is cable TV, with 62% of men and 68% of women watching cable TV on a weekly basis, but also almost 50% of men are watching YouTube on a weekly basis, 47% of boomer men are watching YouTube on a weekly basis, and 39% of women. And that number is approximately the same as those who are watching network TV, so 46% of men and 38% of women watching network TV on a weekly basis, and we see the Netflix number being much lower. So even though they're characterized by, in this case, their proclivity is clearly to cable TV, we also do see an openness of about half of them to alternative entertainment channels. So this idea that we really need to be thinking about how do we utilize things like pre-roll and Facebook autoplay or Facebook click-to-play or other types of video formats is not something that just applies to younger audiences. It really applies across the board, from your youngest millennials to your oldest boomers. And that's important to keep in mind both from a messaging perspective, but also from a perspective of which brands can be in this space, because it suggests that brands that are typically thought of as older brands that tend to gravitate towards more traditional channels also may have a space in some of these new emerging formats. So I think we've underscored this in the digital portraits, but I just want to show you this so that it really drives home the point of this generational swing. So now more than ever, we just see an immense generational swing in terms of device usage. When we look at which of the following things audiences did yesterday, we see, and this is not surprising, but here are some numbers to put behind it, that the percentage of them who watched TV directly goes down as audiences get younger. So 91% of boomers watched TV yesterday. That number drops to 86% when we look at Gen X and down to 77% when we look at millennials, right? Just as the percentage of those who used internet on their smartphones goes down as audiences get older. So while 77% of millennials used the internet on their smartphone yesterday and 60% of Gen Xers did the same, only 42% of boomers used the internet on their smartphone yesterday. And then the numbers for laptop actually, they look a lot more like TV, right? And that older audiences are more likely to have used the internet on their laptop yesterday. 71% of boomers used the internet on the laptop yesterday, 67% of Gen Xers, and 58% of millennials. Finally, as for tablet is a mixed story, and I think, like many marketers, there's still a desire to really understand how tablet is fitting in. We know its role, but it's interesting to see if you look at this by generation, there's a little bit of a blip among Generation X, but 34% of them used the internet on the tablet yesterday, and then that number drops both for older and younger, with only 30% of millennials using it and 26% of boomers using it. So what we're seeing is that tablet is a nice to have, but does not have the same essential nature truly as a smartphone, as smartphones or TVs, which makes it interesting from a marketing perspective, and we'll get into that a little bit more. So why is this? What do we think, before we start really deep diving into the numbers, what do we think it is that's driving preferences to various screens? So one of the questions we asked was, if you have a task to do that's a certain length, what's your preferred screen? So we see for those very low touch tasks, right, tasks that will take between 0 and 5 minutes, audiences from all age groups overwhelmingly prefer to go to their smartphone. So think about something like checking the weather, where that task is taking you a minute, maybe 2 minutes. For that, audiences are clearly gravitating towards smartphones. But as the task gets more complex, that number starts to drop. And where we really see the inflection point, right, where we go away from smartphones and then laptop really starts to take off, is somewhere between 15 and 20 minutes. Audiences put down their smartphone and opt for a laptop. So this has important consequences. So at the last part of the presentation, we'll really talk about the consumer journey. And so this has really important implications for shopping and purchase, that when we're thinking about those shopping and purchase where really attention is important, detail is important, and you can't really finish the transaction until you have need to make sure every detail is right, those type of things audiences tend to gravitate towards laptops for, because they just won't put the same investment of time into smartphone usage. What is it that the factors that are affecting, other than time, the other factors cited by audiences as affecting their choice for screen usage are screen size. This is very important. So 28% of boomers and 28% of millennials said this is most important, and speed and performance, followed by device they log in with, device they keep closest to them, display and quality of image less important, and ease of typing is less important. So let's take a look at their daily digital activities here. So across generations, screen preference very much varies by activity. And while millennials, who are down at the bottom, are very much smartphone centric, we see the Gen Xers and boomers hold strong preferences for laptops and PCs. So if you look in that top chart there, you'll see that this is boomers' screen preferences. And what the height of it tells you is the percentage of respondents who do that activity, and then their preferred screen. So we see for boomers pretty much across the board for all of those activities, their preferred screen is laptops. It gets a little bit closer with checking weather between laptops and smartphone, and whatever is most readily available. So that's a new code, right? So if you look at the gray, that's whatever is most readily available. But we see that pretty much for all activities, boomers are preferring to go to a laptop or PC. After that, it becomes whatever is readily available, but it's not really ever smartphones or tablets. That's a little bit different for Gen X. So we see for Gen X, though, for most things, they also still prefer laptops and PCs. We see for checking the weather, they clearly prefer smartphones, and for checking sports or visiting sports sites, it's really a toss-up between whatever's available and laptops, PCs. That's not necessary. Laptops, PCs aren't necessarily their go-to device for that. And then finally, for millennials, it's a little bit of a different story. So for visiting news sites, laptops and PCs are more important, and that again comes back to that idea of attention and task time. But then as we go to checking sports scores, checking the weather, and even watching short video clips, we see that smartphones are the device of choice. For lifestyle blogs, we see that it's laptops and PCs. And then for visiting health sites, we see that that's pretty much a toss-up between laptops and smartphones. So just in more detail, right, the preferred screen for boomers across the board, you see that 60%, just to look at the scope of this, for visiting news sites, 60% of boomers are preferring news sites. For watching short video clips, 57% of boomers prefer to watch short video clips on a laptop or PC. And for visiting health sites or looking for information about health concerns, 55% of them prefer to use a laptop PC. So this is really important when we think about it for a couple of reasons. One, it's important for thinking about where the weight of our media goes when we're thinking about advertising that's about health, that's probably going to run on health websites, and we're trying to think about the allocation of that across the various screens. We really do see that perhaps the laptop and PC is the best place to allocate that. Let's take a look at the same thing for Gen X. So as I mentioned before, visiting news sites, again, this is a higher attention, higher investment task. So they do prefer to do this on laptops, PCs. But then when you look at something that's lower investment, lower attention, like checking sports scores, it's really just whatever is available. And when it's very low touch, like checking the weather, they do tend to go to smartphones. But we see that what this graph is really showing is just the very transitional nature of Gen X, and how really important the task is. So one of the things is when we're marketing to Gen X, right, really thinking about, before we think about, oh, it's Gen X, we should put a larger investment on mobile, we should put a larger investment in laptop. The real predicate question to this is really, what's the task that we want to tie into, right? What do we want to tie into? What's the mindset we need? And then based on that, which is the right device to really reach them in that place? And then finally, the preferred screen for millennials, we see that for visiting news sites, it still is the laptops and PCs. For visiting lifestyle blogs and health sites, it's still laptops and PCs. But then for checking sports sites, it's overwhelmingly smartphones. For checking the weather, it's overwhelmingly smartphones. And even for watching short video clips, it's overwhelmingly smartphones. So this, I would say, as confirmation and some numbers around that millennials do tend to be more mobile in most ways, but not always. Again, carving out an exception for high attention, high investment tasks. So let's take a look at the entertainment channel preferences. So we see that millennials spend more time consuming content on new media platforms such as YouTube, while boomers are more TV-centric. I think this is not necessarily surprising. I think what's most important about this graph is really using this graph as a pivot point for thinking about what this means about how we're going to market to these groups when we want to tie our marketing very closely to media or entertainment. So it suggests that YouTube is certainly potentially one of the best options when we want to reach millennials while they're watching entertainment, but also it's a pretty strong bet for Gen X. Not quite as good for boomers, where we're better off going to cable TV and to a lesser extent network TV. And we see that the uptake for alternative channels like Hulu and Apple TV and Amazon Prime is not quite there so much with younger generations yet. That still tends to be a lot lower incidence. But remember, we're only talking about up to age 18 here. So emerging still, a group that we can now start to survey soon will be Gen Z, and these numbers will change even more. So what these numbers really also show you is that, even though these numbers are small, there's a growing need to figure out how the face of marketing looks different when we think about TV as not just TV consumed from traditional channels, but really this idea of TV over the internet. How is that different from both a targeting perspective and also from a format perspective? And we see this as an emerging thing that we should be having these conversations about that now. And then when we look at what actual physical screen they like to look at it at, I think the distinction here, right, is that curation of content in the channels where they want that, they're really looking for emerging things. But when we look at the actual physical screen, for the most part, millennials are still preferring to watch their entertainment on a TV screen, even if it's Netflix or streaming programming or Hulu or Apple TV. It's only really YouTube that they prefer to watch on laptops or smartphones. So when someone's in an entertainment mode, the physical screen still is actually TV. And that holds true across both Gen X and boomers. Okay, so finally, how does this relate to the consumer path to purchase? So what we see here is that if we see throughout the consumer journey, even though we have this idea of that, shopping has moved completely mobile, right? It's not just purchase we're interested in. The consumer journey really starts with this idea of research, doing one's homework about the specific thing, and then completing the purchase. And we still see that while it's an interesting soundbite to say that the consumer journey has completely moved mobile, across all generations, there's still a very heavy reliance on laptops and PCs. So as we think about this, from an activation perspective, what this really suggests, again, is that we really have to match this fragmentation with the diversification of media across all of these screens. And instead of thinking about just strictly weight, really thinking also about, what is it that's our objective through the particular creative that we're running? Is our objective just to build awareness? Is our objective to get them to do consumer research? Is our objective for them to transact and close the purchase? And really, depending upon that brand objective, placing the creative on that channel rather than just saying, I'm going to weight more heavily to laptop PC or I'm going to weight more heavily to mobile. And I think when you see the numbers, it will become clear exactly why that's so important, why it's more important to think about the overlay of the purchase funnel with the potential channels and the potential screens rather than just sort of unilateral thoughts on going more heavily on one screen or another. So taking a look at millennials, again, that's the group that's 18 to 34. So even for the mobile-first millennials, so what you'll see that top number there, the yellow bar, that's laptops and PCs. So interestingly, for something like automotive, they're as likely to have reached for their smartphone as for their laptop or PC in the past 6 months to either do product search or research about automobiles. So 29% of them have used their smartphone in the past 6 months to do product search or research about automobiles, and 28% have done the same on a laptop or PC. We see this number across the board for millennials at tablets, just really lagging behind. Only 12% of them have used their tablets for doing automotive search or research. When we get to financial services, we start to really see this gap happening. So that idea before we talked about the investment that's required of time and attention really becomes more important. So you'll see the biggest gulfs for millennials between their going to use a smartphone versus going to use a laptop as being in those products that require higher investment of attention, those big ticket items. Financial service, where are you going to put your money? Pretty important that you get those decisions right, that you don't make mistakes about which stock you buy or how much you're paying on a particular bill, things like that. And consumer electronics, making sure that you get the right thing, because those do tend to be higher investment purchases. But those things, they still do tend to go to laptops and PCs because of the need to spend more time and pay more attention to what they're doing. When we get to lower investment purchases like CPG, we do see that it's pretty much equally likely that they've used a laptop, PC, or a smartphone. So 39% of them have used a laptop, PC to do search, research, or purchase of consumer packaged goods, and 37% have done the same with a smartphone. And then when we look at wireless or cable acquisition, we see that smartphone just slightly nudges out wireless cable, but I wouldn't make too much of that 1 percentage point, and the same with purchase or research about travel. So let's move on to Generation X. What we see is Generation X is transitional, We talk about them as really it being task-related, but we see for all of these tasks that automotive, financial services, consumer electronics, and CPG, wireless, and travel, they do tend to still prefer using laptops and PCs. And interestingly, the gulf between whether they're going to use a smartphone or going to use a laptop PC is actually the greatest for consumer packaged goods. So one of the ways in which we can be thinking about that I put this as a question, not necessarily as a theory, but are the consumer packaged goods purchases of your middle life Gen Xers, are those different than they would be for millennials? I'm going to suggest that they probably are, and that they require more time and attention, potentially larger purchases that they're making, and so it becomes easier and more convenient to do those things on a laptop PC than it is to do those on a smartphone, and that's why we see that 22 percentage point difference between them. The other thing that's interesting about this group, if you toggle back and forth, is that you see that even for something like CPG purchase, they're still more likely to use their tablets than millennials are. And so, one of the questions that I think remains still an open question for more consideration is really trying to understand the exact role that tablets play. This is something that's really eluded marketers for a long time, we intuitively know that smartphones and tablets are different. But what really is that difference, and what is the best true purpose or true use of a tablet, or is a tablet just a nice to have? We do see that tablet usage does tend to be higher, at least in the consumer journey, for Gen Xers than it is for millennials. And then finally, looking at boomers, again, across the board, we see that laptops and PCs is by far their preferred device, with very large gaps, both in terms of the purchase of consumer packaged goods, consumer electronics. So 46% of boomers have searched or search, research, or purchased for consumer electronics on their laptops and PCs, compared to only about 12% of them who've done it on a tablet and 10% who've done it on a smartphone. So even noticing there that the smartphone is rarely even preferred over the tablet is interesting. I think the other interesting thing that I would point out on this chart is still, if you look at it, again, coming back to this idea of really not discounting the baby boomer, the baby boomers do have a very large digital footprint. We talked before about how they have huge purchasing power, and a tremendous amount of, I think something like 80% of the assets in the U.S. are controlled by boomers. So it's really important that even in things like consumer packaged goods, we really consider them in our digital marketing strategy, because 54% of them in the past 6 months have used their laptops or PCs for purchasing or searching about consumer packaged goods. So to close this all up, so what do we take from this? What I think that this deck is most helpful for is, or this presentation is most helpful for, is really identifying the areas where we need to have some reflection, right? And really focusing on the essentials again. It is very easy in our industry to get swayed by trends and to feel like we are missing out or behind, and it's sometimes important, particularly in the beginning of the year, to really re-anchor ourselves in the essentials of what it is that people are doing and what their true preferences are in the moment, not for what we think they're going to be 6 to 8 months to 2 years to 4 years from now. We think that it's also really important to pay attention to psychographics. So even though we talk mostly about generation within this, right, we know that looking at people strictly in terms of age and gender can only take us so far. So when we think about, who is it that we really want to reach with this campaign, is it enough for us to say that it's important to reach women 18 to 24, or is that audience truly so diverse that we really need to start peeling back the layers and looking at them differently, right? Is it some behavior that's important? Is it some psychographic bent or sentiment that's important? Third, when we're thinking about the investment of where we're going to put our money, both in terms of media plans and also in things like app development, really considering the activity or the involvement. So if there is $1 million to be spent either on building a new app or making upgrades to a website, it's really important to think about what is that activity or task that app or that website is going to be used for, and how are people using it, and really using that as the threshold question to decide the investment. And really it ultimately comes down to understanding our consumer base. So what some of these slides in this deck do is really show you just how quickly these audiences are shifting. And so just making sure that we're regularly having a way that we can listen to and monitor the behavior and the preferences of our consumers becomes so important. So what are my final, more pointed recommendations, right? So understand who the marketer, who your marketer is reaching by more than just demographics. When evaluating digital ad performance, consider the differential impact by device. So this is really not, a mobile versus desktop world. It's really a smartphone versus tablet versus laptop PC world. Optimize messaging across screens based on audience and generation and screen preferences. If your campaign's goal is to drive consumers' behaviors like search and research, really ensure that marketing investment, where you're investing money, is matching the screen preference. So it's impossible to ask consumers if they're doing something totally unrelated, to basically stop what they're doing, switch devices, and research something totally different. But if we can catch them in the moment, we know that our advertising can be a lot more impactful. So really considering their screen preferences for purchase and research is so important. So, and finally, investing in the next and the now. So even though we know that audiences are shifting to mobile, it's still really important to consider laptops and PCs, particularly for those purchase and acquisition activities. And then finally, really committing to holistic insights that explore not just the individual components, but really tell a complete story. And looking for ways that can more, rather than providing you data points, will really provide a narrative about what's going on with your consumer and your consumer base. Super. With that, I would say thank you very much. I think we have a few minutes to take questions, so I will go silent and allow you, if you have questions, to type them in now. And I'd be happy to answer questions for a few minutes. I would say that this presentation, as well as additional data and additional thought leadership, are available on the millwardbrown.com website, so I would encourage you to go there if there's something in particular you're looking for. And thank you for your time and attention today. With that, I'll turn it over to Katie.
Thanks, Jolene. So you shared a lot of good data today. What surprised you most about the findings?
I think what surprised me most, and it's controversial in a not controversial way, is really still not counting out laptops and PCs, and I think that becomes really particularly important when we think about some of the advances too that Google's making in the laptop PC market, and that it can often be actually more affordable to buy for younger generations to buy a laptop PC via Google than it can be to buy a tablet, right? So really not counting out, even though it's tempting to say, mobile is the more interesting thing. And all of the advances that are happening on mobile, it's really important too that we still get the fundamentals right of how laptops and PCs fit into a marketing plan, both in terms of advertising and consumer touch.
Thanks. So another question here is, traditionally marketers aren't very interested in the 50-plus segment, but you spent a lot of time on them today. So why should marketers care about this group?
I think, as I noted earlier in the presentation, their purchase power is enormous. They have a lot of longevity to be considered. 50 is no longer considered old. And they really do have a large digital footprint. So even though we know for some potential activities their footprint is large offline, as we saw in some of those consumer journey numbers, a lot of them are still shopping online on a regular basis. And so it's important that we really continue to try to capture them online.
Awesome, thank you. How does programmatic fit into what you've learned about screen preferences, Joline?
Yeah, so I think, and I'll take that as the last question, which is that I think what's interesting about programmatic is that what it really does is it gives us the opportunity, and I think this is something that has not been very tapped into yet, but is to really use the ability to find people, right, and target people directly, rather than using programmatic in a way that we're finding a person and showing them the same ad over and over and over again. It really does allow us to do sequencing with them. So when we think about something like how we encourage a consumer to come down the purchase funnel with us, right? Think about how much more powerful programmatic can be if we're unveiling parts of our story sequentially, or consider a new product, right? If we're using programmatic to first build awareness, then drive home messaging, then really talk about the attributes of the product, and then finally encourage them to search, research, or purchase, and even with some direct incentives. We can really see programmatic in this very different light, that it's not really just about clicks and getting our audience to programmatically click and showing them the same ads over and over again until they do that, but we can really see that as a very powerful tool for brand building.
Great, thanks Joline. So I think that's all the time we have for questions right now. Thank you everyone for joining us. We'll be sending out a recording of this presentation, so look out for that, and have a great day.